I'd like to welcome our guest speaker, Matt Schoonover. Matthew, I cheat, I call him Matt. Matt
Totally fine.
Thank you. Matt is a founding and managing member of Schoonover and Moriarty law firm. He counsels clients on all aspects of their work with the federal government, from understanding acquisition regulations and contract provisions to ensuring compliance with the regulations relating to small business and socioeconomic program eligibility, and to developing mentor-protege programs, joint venture agreements, and subcontracts. Schoonover and Moriarty also represent contractors in bid protests, size and socioeconomic eligibility protests, and performance disputes. Above all, Matt enjoys helping small businesses like yours succeed in the federal marketplace. With that, I'd like to turn it over to Matt. And thank you so much, Matt.
Thank you, Jody. It's a pleasure to join you today. I really appreciate the opportunity to work with not only Jody, but PTACs all across the country because of the services that they provide to small business federal contractors. And I really think that they are just a tremendous resource. And I'm happy that everybody is here today or is watching this online, because it means that you have in some way connected with your PTAC. And if you want to do work with the federal government, I always encourage folks to connect with their PTAC and talk with them about their services that they can provide, because it really is I think, in the spirit of today's presentation, a fundamental for a small business to make it with the federal government. So I'm absolutely delighted that folks have joined us today, again, because it means that you have connected with your PTAC. And I certainly hope that this helps foster that relationship. Next slide, please, Jody. I am Matthew Schoonover, and as she mentioned, I am the managing member of Schoonover and Moriarty. The point of this slide is not for you to see my face, but rather just to note that although I am an attorney, please don't take today's presentation to be legal advice. There are complicated legal issues when you speak with or want to work with the federal government. And so I always encourage folks to make sure that you're reaching out, to counsel for assistance on your specific issues. Please don't take today's presentation to be legal advice. Next slide, please. Now, we'll start today by talking, as Jody mentioned, about why business size is such a big deal. One of the fundamentals that comes from being a small business federal contractor, the fundamental thing from being a small business federal contractor is whether your business is actually small. So we'll talk about why being a small business matters and a little bit about how you can know if your business is actually small. And then once we've established why being a small business matters, we'll talk about ways that small businesses can increase their competitiveness for future procurements. And I tend to think, that there are kind of three different ways that parties can really, or small businesses can really increase their opportunities to earn federal government contracts. And the first is going to be through participating in SBA's socioeconomic programs, if you're eligible for them. That is a good way to not only limit competitive pools, but also, I think, open up additional markets for you. We'll also talk about teaming and joint ventures and SBA's mentor protege program. I think these are wonderful opportunities, particularly as we see contracts be consolidated into fewer awards of a greater and greater value. Small businesses in particular need to understand how they can make themselves more competitive for those more selective acquisitions. And then finally, one of the ways, I think what they say is past is prologue, and understanding earning a contract isn't the end goal. Certainly a business wants to earn a contract, but ultimately it wants to perform that contract and perform it well. Doing so helps create that inertia and helps make your business more competitive for future awards. And so we'll talk about a few tips to how to increase your successful performance once you have actually earned that contract. Next slide, please. So I will say before we break into things, our firm runs govconbrief.com. It's a legal blog that discusses some of these issues as they relate to small business federal contractors. So if you haven't checked out GovCon Brief yet, I would certainly encourage you to do so and hopefully to make it a resource. So with that, let's go ahead and break into why being a small business matters when it comes to federal procurements. And really, small businesses, I think that there is a misperception among government contractors that in order to be successful, you have to be a behemoth. You have to be the Lockheed Martins, the SAICs, the Raytheons, these massive companies that when everybody thinks about government contractors, they're the first names that kind of pop into mind. But that's not the case. Small businesses play a truly important role in federal government contracts. And in fact, the Small Business Act says that the federal government should set goals, sets goals for the federal government to award prime contracts to small businesses. And right now, 23%, at least 23% of all prime contract awards need to be given to small businesses in accordance with the Small Business Act. That doesn't necessarily sound like a lot. It's a quarter roughly of all contracts need to go to small businesses. But when you think about the volume of contracts that the federal government issues every year, it's a tremendous amount. We see the federal government approaching appropriations at about $1 trillion. I think it was about $750 billion most recently for every year for its spending. And this is spread across all different agencies and for various goods and services that the federal government might need to buy. And so when we consider just the volume of contracts that the government awards here in the fiscal year 2020, the latest year that we have data available from the government, it was about $146 billion in prime contract awards went to small businesses. And we see this on the next slide where it is not just small businesses that receive this benefit. Certainly they do. And we'll talk here in a moment about these other socioeconomic designations as well. But, if your company is a woman-owned small business, service-disabled, veteran-owned small business, an 8A company, or a HUBZone company, opportunities exist for you as a prime contractor. And the government, in addition to the 23% goal, also has sub-goals for these various socioeconomic categories. And so when we talk about socioeconomic categories, having one of these designations means that you're eligible for these different contracts. Next slide, please. But it's not just prime contracts under which small businesses get a benefit. Small businesses are sought after as subcontractors as well. Every year when the government issues contracts on an unrestricted basis, those contracts oftentimes have to include a subcontracting plan under which that business, in many cases, has to commit to subcontracting out a certain percentage or dollar value of that award to small businesses or any of the various socioeconomic programs. So it's not just prime contract awards. Subcontracts are an opportunity for small businesses really to make a name for themselves in the federal market. And in fact, I have clients that pretty much do exactly that. They serve exclusively as subcontractors on federal projects. And so as you're thinking about how to establish yourself as a successful government contractor, how to make it in the federal marketplace, I would encourage you to expand beyond just thinking about a prime contract award. Think also about how your business might serve as a subcontractor. And we see some of these benefits to small businesses on this slide here that, really the federal government does a lot to award contracts to small businesses, and to be admitted into any of these socioeconomic programs, which we'll discuss here in a moment. The primary consideration is that the firm has to be a small business under its primary NAICS code. Large businesses don't qualify for socioeconomic program eligibility. And in addition to being admitted to these programs, or sometimes as part of your admission to these programs, your business may be eligible for set-aside or sole source opportunities. That is for a set-aside contract. If the government was going to set aside a contract for small businesses, or for 8A companies, woman-owned small businesses, service-disabled veteran-owned small businesses, or HUBZone small businesses, as the case may be, in order to be eligible to win that contract, you would have to have that socioeconomic designation, or that small business status. So in other words, we're limiting the pool of offerors who are eligible to bid on these opportunities. And in some cases, you might not even have to compete against other folks at all. That is, some contracting officers do have discretion in some circumstances to award a directed or a sole source award, a non-competitive award to a small business. And so that means that you wouldn't even necessarily have to compete. You would just be granted that contract. So small business size is very important. And in order to determine whether your business is actually small, as I've mentioned, the NAICS code is going to have the primary importance. For your business socioeconomic eligibility, it's going to be your firm's primary NAICS code. For a contractual eligibility, it's going to be the NAICS code that is assigned to that particular solicitation. For each NAICS code, the SBA has assigned a corresponding size standard. If your business falls under that corresponding size standard, you're a small business under that NAICS code. If it's over that size standard, then unfortunately you would be a large business under that NAICS code. And these size standards come in really either of two varieties. The first is a dollar or a receipts-based size standard, which apply to services contracts, including construction services. To determine your receipts, you're going to calculate your total income added to your cost of goods sold as those items are reported on your tax returns. You're going to do that for the preceding 5 calendar years and average that out. And if that average falls under the associated size standard, then you're a small business under that receipts-based size standard. For the other size standard is an employee-based size standard, which applies to manufacturing or supply-based contracts. And for employee-based calculations, you're going to take the average number of employees over the preceding 12 calendar months or 24 calendar months, depending on when you're watching this video. And if that number falls under the associated employee count, then you're a small business. And so that's how the SBA is going to determine whether your business is small. And it's important to know that as we go in. Next slide, please. Because really, you know, the thing we're going to talk about, the heart of what we're going to talk about is, as a small business, how can you increase your competitiveness for federal contract awards? I alluded to this earlier, or I mentioned this earlier, that over the last several years, we have seen a steady decline in the number of contracts being awarded. But we have seen over that same period an increase in the average amount, or in the annual amount of these small business contracts cumulatively. So what that means is we're seeing fewer and fewer contracts awarded, but at a greater and greater amount for each contract. And we've seen this, you know, through consolidated opportunities, through IDIQ contracts, and these large best-in-class contracts, meaning that small businesses face increasing competitiveness when it comes to earning these contracts. And really, when the government evaluates an opportunity. We're seeing many more of these be awarded on a best value continuum, meaning that the government might be willing to pay more money.
How are you?
For
Good.
for a sorry about that. The government may be willing to pay more money for a particular, or in response to a particular solicitation, if it perceives technical benefits to that solution that outweigh, or that mean it's worth paying that higher price for them. In many cases, the pendulum has swung against what we call lowest price technically acceptable procurements, or LPTA procurements. The FAR now restricts the government's ability to use LPTA solicitations, and instead, I think, kind of has a presumption in favor of best value. For small businesses, that can be a good thing, because I think small businesses sometimes have less flexibility when it comes to pricing. You know, maybe their overhead is lower and they're unable to shave off quite as much to mean they have a lower price, but that, small businesses oftentimes are able to provide technical ingenuity or adaptability that might make them a better value, notwithstanding their higher price. And so when the government is evaluating these opportunities, it is generally going to consider them on things like your technical capabilities, your past performance, socioeconomic categories. And so we'll see now on the next slide how a small business might be able to limit that competition in order to make them more competitive. And I do think that this is really, if we're talking about tips to making it in the federal marketplace for small businesses, this is really the first tip that I have for those small businesses, is determine how you can limit the scope of your competition for these opportunities. And I think a really good way to do that is by obtaining your socioeconomic designations, that you're eligible for. Because under these various socioeconomic designations, contracting officers, as I mentioned, can issue set-aside procurements under which only these businesses holding these set-aside designations, or these socioeconomic designations, are eligible. And you may also be eligible for sole source awards. But again, beyond being eligible as a prime contractor, socioeconomic designations can really give you a leg up for subcontracting as well. I mentioned that a lot of times unrestricted contracts will have subcontracting plans. And as part of those subcontracting plans, businesses oftentimes have to identify a certain amount of contracts that they will give to these socioeconomic small businesses. So it's important not only in the grand scheme of earning a prime contract, but to market your business as a potential subcontractor as well. So on the next slide, let's take a look at the first, kind of the granddaddy socioeconomic program, so to speak. And this is the 8A Business Development Assistance Program, or the 8A Business Development Program. The 8A program is open for businesses that are at least 51% owned and controlled by persons who are socially and economically disadvantaged and are of good character. So really here, the eligibility is focused on these two aspects: social disadvantage and economic disadvantage. For social disadvantage, the program is really geared at folks who have faced discrimination based on race, gender, nationality, or other characteristics that they might have, that have impacted their ability to fully participate in the American economy. If you are not a member of a group that is presumed to have experienced such disadvantage, you still might be able to apply and be admitted to the 8A program if you show some other characteristic that has led to that disadvantage. You also, I mentioned, have to be economically disadvantaged. You have to show that your ability to participate in the economy through education, through employment, or other opportunities has been impacted because of your social disadvantage. And you also have to show that your annual income, your net worth, and the fair market value of your assets fall under prescribed standards by the SBA. Beyond that, your company has to demonstrate an ability to succeed in the marketplace. In general, your company has to have done some work, has to have been in business for more than 2 years in order to demonstrate your ability to succeed. One of the big problems that I see with the 8A program is that once folks get into the program, they spend a lot of time, they spend a lot of money, they spend a lot of effort getting into the program because it is very document intensive and time intensive to get into the 8A program. And once they're in, they tend to think, oh, great, now I'm going to get all these contracts. But no, you still have to show or still have to compete in many cases for these opportunities, and having prior experience as a contractor is oftentimes very vital. I think it's a little risky when folks try and join the 8A program or get admitted to the 8A program and never bid on or performed a government contract before, because really they could be spending the first few years of a defined term in the program trying to chase that first contract, and that can be difficult for businesses to do. But if you are an established contractor in the 8A program, then I think there is tremendous benefit. Every year the government needs to award at least 5% of its contracts to 8A program participants. And every year we kind of see the government blow this out of the water. In 2020, it awarded almost 11% of its contracts to 8A participants, totaling almost $60 billion. Now, we are also seeing that this 5% goal is being increased. The Biden administration has announced plans to increase it to, I think it's 11% in 2023, all the way up to 15%, I think, over the next 5 years. And so we are seeing more of a focus on awarding contracts to 8A companies. And for that reason, it really is kind of considered, in my mind, the granddaddy of the socioeconomic program. But it's not the only socioeconomic program. Next slide, please. We also see programs for service-disabled veteran-owned small businesses, for example. You see, in order to be eligible, the business has to be at least 51% owned and unconditionally controlled by a service-disabled veteran. That veteran has to, as I mentioned, control the company. Ownership is oftentimes the easiest eligibility requirement for many of these programs. It's the control aspect that can be difficult to put into place. But that veteran has to control the management and day-to-day operations of the business and has to hold the highest officer position within the company. They also have to devote sufficient time, usually full time, to the company to make sure that they actually are controlling it. Now, the SDVOSB program is unique because right now there's currently 2 programs. There's one that is run by the SBA and one that is run by the VA, the Department of Veterans Affairs. They are 2 distinct programs as of right now. But in order to be eligible as an SDVOSB for VA opportunities, and there are a lot of special contracting benefits for SDVOSBs or veteran-owned small businesses at the VA, a company has to, as of right now, be certified by the VA as an SDVOSB or a VOSB. And that's to earn contracts at the VA. SBA, I mentioned, has a separate program, and that applies essentially to every agency other than the VA. That is a self-certification program. As of right now, you can simply certify that you are a SDVOSB if you want to be eligible for, say, DoD SDVOSB opportunities. But by the end of, by early 2023, we anticipate that these programs will be consolidated. Essentially, the VA certification program is going to get it picked up and moved over to the SBA. And we expect to see that, as I mentioned, roll out by 2023. Certainly take a look at GovCon brief because we'll update folks as that news comes out. But once that consolidation comes into play, then the SBA will run a government-wide certification for SDVOSBs. SDVOSBs also get a contracting benefit, 3% prime contract goal for SDVOSB companies. In 2020, they hit that goal and awarded about $24 billion in prime contracts to service-disabled veteran-owned small businesses. Next slide, please. Woman-owned small businesses, if the business, a woman owns at least 51% and unconditionally controls that small business, that business may be eligible for WOSB program participation. This is now no longer a self-certification program, though. It used to be that woman-owned small businesses could self-certify. As such, now woman-owned small businesses need to either get certification from the SBA itself through certify.sba.gov or through one of 4 certifying entities. And you can find more information about that process on SBA's website. Women-owned small businesses do also get a prime contract goal. Not every solicitation, though, or not every NAICS code is eligible for woman-owned small business set-asides. A lot of them are, and SBA is adding more and more NAICS codes, it seems, every year to those that are eligible for woman-owned small business or economically disadvantaged woman-owned small business set-asides. But right now it's not every NAICS code. So it's a little bit more of a restricted program, but even still, there is a 5% goal for prime contract awards to be awarded to women-owned small business companies. 2020 the government almost hit that mark. They fell just a little bit shy. They've kind of historically struggled to meet the woman-owned small business goal with intermittent success in doing so. But we still see about $27 billion in contract awards annually, or in 2020, to woman-owned small businesses. Next slide, please. The next program is the HUBZone program. And the HUBZone program is unique because where the other programs we have talked about have kind of focused their eligibility on the owners of the business, the HUBZone program really focuses the eligibility on the area of the business and its employees. The HUBZone is short for historically underutilized business zone. And the goal of the program is to essentially influx dollars, contracting dollars, into communities that have been struggling. These are rural communities. Sometimes they're urban communities, but they're generally poorer, more distressed communities. Sometimes they've had a base move away from them. There's different definitions of hub zones, but in order to be eligible as a hub zone business, the company has to be at least 51% owned by US citizens. Its principal office has to be located in a hub zone, and we'll talk more about that in just one second. And at least 35% of the business's employees have to live in a hub zone. Again, the goal is to bring dollars into these communities. So by making sure that the company has its principal office in the community and that a certain number of employees live within hub zones, this program helps to bring dollars to those distressed communities. Unfortunately, though, the HUBZone program, the government just continues to struggle to meet the goal. It can be difficult for the government to do it for a variety of reasons, but SBA has been trying of late to make it easier through changing the HUBZone regulations, and we'll talk about that again in one second. but still only about less than 2.5% of federal contracts, prime contracts, went to hub zones in 2020, short of the 3% goal. And that even still is higher than the government has been in a long time. And so it's, in my mind, particularly problematic that the government continues to fail to meet its hub zone goal, because that means that these dollars aren't going to these communities as intended. Now, notwithstanding that, there are still opportunities for hub zone businesses out there. In 2020, in fact, we saw $14 billion of prime contracts go to hub zone companies. So certainly there are opportunities for hub zones out there, just not as much as, you know, Matt Schoonover thinks that there should be. Next slide, please. So I mentioned that the first main requirement to the HUBZone program is to have your principal office designated in a hub zone or located in a hub zone. And I want to kind of unpack that for a second, because principal office is not necessarily synonymous with the company's headquarters. It could be, but not necessarily. A principal office under the HUBZone regulations is basically the location where the greatest number of employees work. This is not a job site, you know, on a construction site or that. This is the full location where the greatest number of employees work. Importantly, you have to actually conduct business at this location. You can't just have, you know, a post office box or a random office located in a hub zone and claim that to be your principal office. Rather, as I mentioned, it's got to be the place where the greatest number of your employees work. Now, sometimes one of the problems with this requirement in the past, the principal office requirement, was that the locations for a hub zone can change. A location that's currently in a hub zone, in theory, may not be in a hub zone in 1 year or 2 years or even 5 years. And so hub zone businesses were apprehensive to invest in an office for fear that doing so would cause them to lose their hub zone eligibility. It was a very fair concern. And so SBA has worked around that by modifying its regulations to say that it will reward a company for its long-term investment in a hub zone. That is, if a company buys or leases for a long term, a period of 10 years or more, a location that's in a hub zone that later loses its hub zone designation, it will continue to qualify as a hub zone even after it loses that designation, meaning that the company will not lose or will not be ineligible under the principal office requirement because that map later changed. Now, importantly, this does not apply to every single type of hub zone that is out there, but it does apply to most of them, and it does give businesses the benefit of having some long-term stability in determining their principal office. Next slide, please. The other main requirement to being a hub zone business is the 35% employee residency requirement. And this requirement caused hub zone businesses and prospective hub zone businesses a lot of heartache, because they were oftentimes chasing, you know, where do my employees live at any given time, and how do I determine that they are, you know, in a hub zone? So SBA has changed this requirement, as we'll talk about, but in general, this requirement says that at least 35% of your employees, those folks that you employ on a full-time, part-time, or, you know, other basis, so long as they work at least 40 hours per month, have to reside in a hub zone. And essentially, to make this calculation, you're not just going to count arms and legs, so you'll round to the nearest whole number. But if the person lives full-time at that location for at least 180 days, they will be considered to reside at that location for purposes of HUBZone eligibility. Now, once a company is admitted to the program, this does not mean that, if one of its employees leaves and suddenly it only has 34% of its employees live in a HUBZone, that it will be kicked out of the program. Rather, it has to attempt to maintain that eligibility throughout its duration, meaning that if it ever falls below 20% residency, SBA will determine that it does not meet this requirement. Next slide, please. But again, I mentioned that part of the problem was that businesses were oftentimes chasing where their employees lived, and they would run into problems with people moving. And so SBA recently has adopted a legacy employee rule that has again helped kind of provide some stability for HUBZone businesses. And that is, SBA will now allow a company to continue to claim credit for employees that move from a HUBZone. So long as a person lives in a HUBZone at least 180 days before that HUBZone application or the date of the recertification, and then continues to live there for 180 days after that application or recertification, SBA will continue to consider them as living in a HUBZone, even if they later move away from a HUBZone, so long as there are for the purpose or for the duration of their continued employment with that company. So that means that your business can continue to claim HUBZone residency status for its employees that even move away out of a HUBZone, so long as they live in that HUBZone for a certain period of time. That's a tremendous benefit because, as I mentioned, it allows HUBZone businesses really the opportunity to focus on their business and to not continually chase where their employees are living at any given time. Now, it is still important for employers to know obviously where their employees live and to make sure that they're meeting or attempting to maintain that 35% employee requirement or residency requirement. But this will mean that the company can continue to claim credit towards that requirement, even if one of its employees later moves out of a HUBZone. Now, again, this does not apply to every single type of HUBZone, just most of them. And I will note that the employment has to remain uninterrupted. If that employee leaves the company for any reason and then later rejoins the company, they will not count towards that 35% residency requirement if their new address is outside of the old or is outside of a HUBZone. Doesn't have to be the same HUBZone where the company is located or the principal office is located, just has to be any HUBZone. Next slide, please. So that's kind of the first tip, is to limit the socioeconomic pool or limit the competitive pool, particularly by getting into one of SBA's socioeconomic programs if your business is eligible. Again, doing so will open up opportunities for which your business otherwise might not be eligible to pursue. And so I think that's an important tip for small businesses trying to make it in the federal marketplace. The next tip is really for that business to, kind of make friends, to think about teaming and joint ventures so that that company can augment its skills and capabilities and resources needed to perform on any particular job. And so I want to talk about a little bit about the differences between teaming and joint ventures, because they are different concepts that do carry some different advantages. Next slide, please. The prime sub-team, prime contractor, subcontractor, is really that kind of archetypal relationship, teaming relationship that we talk about under federal government contracts. And really, it's pretty straightforward. It's pretty linear. The federal government awards a prime contract to the prime contractor, who then may issue subcontracts for part of that work downstream to subcontractors. Only that prime contractor has privity of contract with the government. meaning that the prime contractor is responsible to the federal government for the entirety of the work that is under that prime contract, and has to ensure its successful performance under there. But it can subcontract in compliance with the limitation on subcontracting for small business awards, work to subcontractors. Now, the prime sub relationship between the prime contractor and the subcontractor is really governed. It's a creature under state law. Those subcontracts are going to be enforceable under state law, but there are still important federal concepts. Sometimes there can be far flow down provisions that need to be incorporated in there, or other provisions designed to protect either the prime or the sub as it relates to federal government contracting implications. So although they're governed, by state law, they are important under the federal concept as well. Now, one of the things to think about in the prime sub relationship is, if you're pursuing a prime sub relationship, is whether you as a small business prime contractor can claim credit for your subcontractor's past performance. I mentioned in a slide earlier that one of the ways that the government assesses proposals under a best value continuum is through the consideration of past performance. And inevitably, there's probably going to be a case where, as a prime contractor bidding on a contract, your business may not have sufficient examples of recent or relevant past performance to be considered competitive. And in that case, you might want to augment that past performance through a subcontractor. And in many cases, you can do that. The FAR says that when evaluating a small business prime contractor, an agency should consider the experience and past performance of its major subcontractors or of its key personnel. But should doesn't always mean shall. And in some cases, the federal government in various solicitations might say, we are only going to consider the prime contractor's past performance. We're not going to consider this from any subcontractor. It does happen in that case. And even though it may be unduly restrictive, if the agency has a good reason for that restriction, it's going to be very difficult to challenge. And so in that case, how can you as a small business leverage another business's capabilities or experience or past performance to better compete for an opportunity? And that's through a joint venture. Next slide, please. A small business joint venture under SBA's regulations is different from a prime subcontract team. Under a small business joint venture, as we're talking about them under SBA's regulations, there could be different joint venturing concepts under unrestricted or commercial opportunities. Here, I'm talking about small business contracting joint ventures under SBA's regulations. Two or more companies will form a new company as a joint venture, and that new joint venture entity will actually bid on work in its own name. It could be awarded that contract in its own name, but it's actually going to perform that work through the venture companies, through the members to the joint venture. The joint venture itself will not actually employ any of the individuals that perform work under the contract, and instead, the companies, the ventures, perform that through what really is kind of a legal fiction of this separate legal entity. In order to be eligible to participate in a small business joint venture, each venture has to be a small business under the solicitations NAICS code, unless the parties have an SBA-approved mentor-protege agreement. In that case, only the protege's eligibility is going to matter. So the mentor can be a large business, and form a joint venture with a small business protege and be eligible for small business work, so long as the joint venture has a compliant joint venture for SBAs or under that type of socioeconomic designation. SBA's regulations have detailed requirements relating to joint venture agreements. And if a joint venture agreement does not meet those requirements, it will not qualify, or it may not qualify as a small business joint venture. You also have to abide by SBA's rules when it comes to managing the joint venture, meeting various performance restrictions, complying with the limitation on subcontracting and the performance of work requirement. There's also some reporting requirements when it comes to financial aspects or performance aspects, as the case may be. But the benefit to one of these joint ventures is, as I mentioned, the joint venture can rely on each venture's respective past performance, experience, or capabilities in order to perform the contract. That is, SBA's regulations say that when evaluating the proposal of a small business joint venture, a procuring agency not only has to consider those aspects of the joint venture itself, but also those of the individual members as well. And that's a tremendous competitive advantage because, again, the point of one of these joint ventures is to allow these companies to consolidate and their resources, to combine their resources and their performance to make themselves more technically capable of performing the work, hopefully to earn contracts that otherwise would have been out of their individual reach. So that's a tremendous benefit to small business joint ventures. And as we see these, continue to see these opportunities be consolidated, small business joint ventures are becoming more and more popular, more and more ubiquitous under these opportunities. And if you have a mentor, a large business mentor, being able to use their capabilities and their experience and their past performance oftentimes helps provide assurance and support that makes that small business awardee really dynamite when it comes to winning that contract. And so this really should be something that I think every small business is considering as we look to increasing competitiveness for small business awards. Next slide, please. So we talked about how a business can make friends to make themselves more competitive under a particular contract. But I think it's also important to talk about how we might expand beyond that and really develop the company's business or their capability of bidding on federal government contracts. Next slide. I think a great way to do that is through SBA's Mentor Protege program. Under this program, a mentor, could be a large business, could be a small business, but a mentor agrees to provide certain business development assistance that the protege needs to grow and develop their business. And that assistance can really be anything that the protege says it needs to develop. So when I work with proteges, I often tell them, think about your business, where you are now versus where you want to be in 10 years. And in order to get from A to B, from now to 10 years, what's your Christmas list? What items do you need from a business development standpoint to really help you grow? And that's kind of those items of assistance that you should be thinking about including in a mentor-protege agreement. Finding a mentor that will provide some or all of those items of assistance. And under this agreement, the SBA will review to make sure that the mentor is actually providing those items of assistance. The program runs for 6 years, so you can have a 6-year relationship with a mentor. And the goal is that by the time you leave that 6-year program, your business as a protege should be in a better position to compete for opportunities in the federal marketplace. And by and large, I think the program has been pretty successful in ensuring that is the case. And so when we look at the benefits of SBA's Mentor Protege program, the protege is going to get that business development assistance through the agreement. And I encourage folks, listen, if you're in year 3, or every year rather, you should be looking at your agreement with your mentor to see if there's any items that you should amend. Include additional items of assistance. SBA will amend a mentor protege agreement, particularly where you're adding items of assistance to it. And I think that that's very, very important, because a mentor and protege are going to get an exemption from affiliation for the items of assistance that are provided in that mentor protege agreement. Affiliation is essentially a size penalty. If SBA determines a business to be affiliated with another, it's going to add that business's size to the small business. And if that combined size exceeds the size standard, then that small business can lose its small business eligibility. And so affiliation is very problematic for small businesses. And the scope of a party's relationship with another may impact whether there is an affiliation there. But SBA says for those items of approved assistance, we're going to exempt those businesses from affiliation. So again, it's very important to make sure that you're amending your agreement to capture as much assistance as possible. Now, the other benefit I mentioned is really through joint venturing, where a business, a mentor and protege can form a small business joint venture that is eligible for work that the protege itself would qualify for as a prime contractor, provided they have an approved mentor protege agreement and a compliant joint venture agreement. Again, that's really helpful, because ordinarily these joint ventures, both venturers have to be a small business. But this rule is relaxed for a mentor protege joint venture. And in that case, only the size and eligibility of the protege is considered. So that's very, very helpful to these joint ventures and can really make a business more competitive for these acquisitions. So when we're talking about how to make it in the federal marketplace, one of the things that I think it's important for small businesses to consider is taking advantage of SBA's mentor protege program. Find a mentor who is willing to develop your business so that, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 10 years from now, you're in a much better position to earn federal government contracts than you were when you went into the program. I think it's truly one of those programs that has the potential to be really life-changing for small businesses if it's done right. Next slide, please. So now that we've kind of talked in general about some tips on how to earn or make yourself more more competitive for federal government contracts, I want to transition now into how you can ensure successful performance under those contracts. And that's, I think, oftentimes overlooked in the competitive analysis. People focus on winning federal government contracts, and that's great. But as we talked about, one of the things that the government will consider in awarding a contract is your company's record of past performance. You need to have a good record of past performance, or at a minimum, not a bad record of past performance, really, in order for the government to be comfortable awarding you a contract. Past performance is essentially the government's prediction of how well you'll perform under a given contract based on your experiences performing under similar contracts in the past. And so it's really just kind of this assessment: how well does the government think you'll perform based on how well you've performed in the past? And so naturally, we need to include, or we need to increase your ability to successfully perform under awarded federal government contracts. And here I want to kind of talk about 2 different tips that, in my experience, would have helped businesses that have experienced bad performance under a contract, or performance disputes under a contract that may adversely impact their future past performance. The first tip really has to revolve around understanding the opportunity that you are actually bidding on before you submitting a bid. Sometimes the solicitation requirements are unclear, or they're restrictive, or they really counter or don't align with how industry normally performs efforts like this in the past, or related efforts in that industry. And in those cases, I think it's important to discuss those items with the contracting officer before you actually bid on them. Because if the solicitation compels you to perform in one way, and you're used to performing in another way, you in theory could be countering the contracting officer's expectations, and they may be more upset that you're not performing in the way they want you to versus the results that you obtain. So I encourage folks, understand what the contract or what those requirements are actually compelling you to do. And if you think there's something wrong with them, or they don't jive with industry, or they're too restrictive, or they're just plain unclear, ask the contracting officer to clarify or to change them. And if the contracting officer doesn't, then, and it's still an opportunity you want to bid on, consider a pre-bid protest challenging those terms. It could be that those terms are unreasonable for some reason, and maybe the agency or GAO would change them if you were to formally protest them. And so I would certainly consider that. But understanding the requirements, I think, is also helpful, because sometimes contractors just bite off more than they can chew. I've unfortunately seen that happen before, where a company is very excited. They've earned the largest contract that they have performed to date. And then several months in, unfortunately, it was just too large. They didn't have the infrastructure. They didn't have the employees. They didn't have the systems to actually perform under a contract yet. So knowing what you're getting into and taking that kind of measured assessment is really the first step in ensuring successful performance. Nobody wants to earn a contract award, or nobody goes into bidding on a contract thinking, hey, I'm going to earn this thing and really just screw it up. Nobody does that. But thinking honestly about at the outset, what is required, how well you can actually perform that contract, I think is key to ensuring your successful performance under that contract. And maybe, if you're having doubts about your ability to perform, maybe consider forming a prime sub team with somebody to help augment those capabilities, or a small business joint venture with somebody to augment those capabilities. Or in some cases, maybe you say, we can't perform this well the way it's written, or right now we're just not in a place to perform this. Maybe we will be on the next recompete. We're going to sit this one out, or we're going to try and bid this as a subcontractor to somebody and help us gain our experience under this type of work. Those are all important considerations to keep in mind, but they start with understanding the solicitation and what it is the government wants, and taking that honest assessment about whether your business is in a position to perform that. Next slide, please. Then once you're on the job, once you've awarded that contract, I tell folks you need to maintain active conversations with the government, more specifically with the contracting officer. Many times, once you're on site, really it's going to be, your line of communication is going to be the COR, the contracting officer's representative. But really the COR doesn't have power to change the contract, to direct you to do anything or anything like that. And so you need to make sure that you're communicating with the contracting officer about the contract, because really it's the contracting officer who is responsible for the administration of that contract. Sure, they're going to rely on the COR and people on the ground, but at the end of the day, it's the CO. And so you need to make sure that you have a good relationship and open communication with them. Communicate major issues, especially in writing to them. Document issues that you're seeing on site. If you're anticipating scope or schedule or cost changes, write the contracting officer about it. Send them an email. Sometimes the COR has said, well, I want you guys to do this or change this aspect of your contract, or there's that kind of gradual scope creep over the course of a 5-year contract just from things on the ground. Communicate that stuff with the contracting officer, because unless the contracting officer approves it, then in theory, you're on the hook for it as a contractor. And you don't want the COR directing changes, even small, that might increase your cost or affect your ability to perform without raising them to the contracting officer. It doesn't have to be adversarial. It could just be something that says, hey, we discussed with the COR today, and she told us she would like us to do this instead of that. Can you confirm that this is okay under the contract? We anticipate, maybe a small increase to price based on X, Y, and Z. Just something like that. It gives the contracting officer the opportunity to weigh in, and hopefully will make it easier if disputes or the need for an adjustment or a claim down the road arises. The final thing I'll say is make sure that you're keeping detailed performance records. Sometimes we get involved in performance disputes on issues that happened years ago. And at that point, it's difficult for the contractor, it's difficult for subcontractors, it's difficult for the government to recreate issues down the road, particularly as performance is fluid. So I tell folks, make sure you're keeping a detailed record of your performance contemporaneous to what you're doing. Don't just rely on, deliverables and all of that. Have a written narrative, have a log as a contractor that is documenting, difficulties you're experiencing in performance, delays that you're experiencing in performance, the cause of some of these issues, your efforts to discuss them with the contracting officer, your efforts to mitigate them. Make sure that you're keeping detailed performance records in case something does happen down the road and you need to go back and kind of retrace your steps. Now, this doesn't just apply to those cases where there's a formal performance dispute. Sometimes there's something in a CPAR that comes up, or sometimes there's an issue where maybe you need to submit an REA for additional time or additional costs, and it's helpful to have these type of records. And if you can explain them or if you can keep them, it's always easier to justify your performance at the end. So ensuring successful performance, you want to make sure that you're communicating with the federal government, with the contracting officer about any issues that you foresee or are experiencing under the contract, and that you're keeping detailed notes about them, because that can be a good way to rebut any contrary findings. Next slide, please. So with that, these are kind of my tips for making it in the federal marketplace. Again, none of this is legal advice. This is just kind of my anecdotal experience based on working with clients over the years about common issues that small businesses face when it comes to kind of breaking into it. And once they're into it, staying in it. And so I certainly hope that today's presentation was insightful, was helpful to you. If anybody has any questions, I'm happy to answer them. I know we have a few minutes. Otherwise, my contact information is on the screen. Please, as things pop up, feel free to reach out to me. I'm always happy to connect with me on LinkedIn, follow us on GovCon Brief. And I certainly enjoy the opportunity to chat today and everybody's time and attention.
Thank you so much, Matt. There's so much information here that, like I say, you gave us some really nice updates on some of the changes coming around with regard to the NAICS codes. I think there's been an increase in a specific number of NAICS codes with regard to women-owned and some other things. That's part of why it's so helpful to have you do these regular updates with us, because a lot of people may not be as familiar with that unless they're firmly embedded in a particular contract or opportunity or solicitation search. So what I'd like to do now is open this up to questions. If you'd like to unmute and ask a question, introduce yourself, a little bit about your business, and any specific questions you might have for Matt today, feel free to do so. If you're unable to unmute for any reason, just put a quick note in the chat and let me know. And we've got Amy, Bill, Delana. Anyone like to ask a specific question while you've got him here live with you? I'm going to go ahead and say,
I answered them all.
I know, I was going to say, let's see if somebody unmutes and would ask a specific question. I'm going to hit the code on my end. Bill, do you have something you'd like to share with us today?
I am very curious. My firm does professional services. Do you have any case studies of successful mentor-protege relationships in that space?
I don't have any specific case studies, but you know, I standing here today, yes, I can tell you that there are going to be successful cases under the mentor-protege agreements, even in the professional services industry. I think right now there's something like 1,500 active mentor-protege agreements that have been approved by the SBA, and so you can imagine that with such a high number, and by the way, it's increasing continually. But that those agreements have kind of tickled every industry. And in my experience, really the nature of the industry doesn't necessarily matter so much as the assistance the protege needs and that the mentor will provide. And I think ultimately the success of the relationship boils down to the relationship of the parties. You know, how well do they get along together? Do they have a history of working with each other? Do they, you know, are they outside of the program? Do they have experience or a history, you know, between their employees? Maybe one has worked for another and there's a good relationship there. I think those are all kind of key things to keep in mind as you're looking for a potential mentor. Really, at the end of the day, how well your business is going to get along. Can it you know, get along with another business for 6 years, and beyond getting along, are you confident that that mentor is going to provide the assistance you need over the entirety of that period?
Hope you found that information helpful, Bill. Thank you for asking. It's a really good question. Any of our other attendees have a quick question you'd like to ask while we've got Matt here for you?
Well, if not, like I said, you know, feel free to reach out anytime. I'm always happy to answer any questions, and certainly enjoy everybody's time today. And I would also, again, kind of to come full circle, encourage everybody to reach out to Jody and her team as well. I know they are a tremendous resource for small businesses. So it's great that you're here, and I certainly hope that you'll schedule that follow-up.
Thank you, Matt. And thank you for everyone taking the time to meet with us today. We know that you're very, very busy in your business world, but it's so important that we have opportunities for you to learn direct from the resources that we at PTAC rely on a regular basis. And so Matt, Schoonover, Moriarty, your law firm means a great deal to all of us. You're always helping us learn new things every day and share that with our small business partners. So with that, we will wrap up. Thank you, Delana. I'm glad you could join us. And everybody, I will send out a PDF of the slide deck so you can have the contact information and review and links that we have. And I invite you to keep an eye on our calendar and join us again when we all come together to talk about small business, government contracting opportunities. And Matt, thank you again for everything. I wish you safe travels, and I will see you again soon.
My pleasure. Thank you so much.
Have a great day, everyone. Thank you.